The world believed I was fading. They saw the slowed gait, the slight tremor in my hand when I reached for my morning tea, and the way my gaze seemed to drift away during conversations. For a woman who had spent 50 years commanding boardrooms and shaping the global perception of capital, to witness such a quiet descent into frailty was tragic. That was precisely the script I wanted them to read. It began subtly 2 years ago, not with a medical diagnosis, but with a sudden chilling clarity. I was being managed. Not cared for, but managed. My husband Robert, a man whose ambition I had funded and fostered for decades, started talking about my cognitive well-being more than my day-to-day happiness. My godson, Nathan, whom I had mentored since he was a terrified freshman at Yale, would drop by the house, not for conversation, but to ask pointed, testing questions about old family investments. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, a small, carefully orchestrated performance designed to test the waters. Robert would lose my reading glasses right before a scheduled video call with my private banker. Nathan would subtly misplace important documents on my desk, only to discover them later with an exaggerated sigh of relief, often remarking, "Oh, Evelyn, you must have put them away absent-mindedly." I was Evelyn Thorne, the retired academic, the financial strategist who could read a balance sheet like a sonnet. I didn't just handle corporate crises. I specialized in predicting human behavior under duress. My field, behavioral economics, taught me that every act of greed, every breach of trust, follows a predictable pattern. And the pattern I was observing in my own living room was sickeningly familiar. Phase 1. The establishment of concern. It was a cold, lonely realization. The people closest to me, the only people I truly trusted with the inner workings of my private wealth structure, were running an active audit on my mental capacity. They weren't looking for a mistake. They were manufacturing one. The moment of absolute certainty. The moment the script shifted from suspicion to focused retaliation occurred during a simple afternoon stroll in our conservatory. Robert was on the phone, his back to me, believing I was absorbed in pruning a wilted orchid. His voice was low, conspiratorial, laced with a triumphant arrogance I hadn't heard since his first major IPO. "The evaluation next month is key," he muttered into the receiver. "Her long-term memory is still sharp, but the short-term recall is already sporadic. We just need Dr. Harrison to confirm the baseline decline for the trust. It's time to trigger the oversight protocol." The oversight protocol. That was the phrase. It was a boilerplate clause I had insisted on decades ago, designed to protect the family fortune should I ever truly become incapacitated. It allowed for my assets, including my strategic voting rights in several private entities, to be transferred to a designated temporary fiduciary Robert. It was the fail-safe, and he was deliberately pulling the pin. That evening, I did not confront him. I prepared. The first step in any successful counterintelligence operation is to confirm the enemy's assumption. If they believed I was losing my mind, I would help them lose theirs instead. I started my own performance, meticulously researched portrayal of gradual cognitive collapse. The change had to be slow, consistent, and documented just as they needed it to be. I started forgetting specific non-critical details. The name of the new gardener, the PIN code to the wine cellar, or the date of Robert's next golf game. I would leave my favorite hardback books open, face down on random pages, suggesting an inability to maintain focus. But my deterioration was not erratic. It was disciplined. I never forgot the anniversary of our marriage, because that would have been too obvious a cue for a family drama. I forgot the key to the security box that held our old, meaningless insurance policies, because that suggested an inability to handle mundane administrative tasks. I was carefully cultivating the narrative of a sophisticated mind crumbling from the edges. Inward, the performance reached its second phase, the reinforcement of vulnerability, when Nathan was brought in. He was the perfect weapon, smart, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own ethical superiority. He genuinely believed he was helping Robert save the family from my inevitable incompetence. He would spend hours with me, ostensibly helping me organize my paper files. In reality, he was conducting inventory. I let him. I even assisted him, handing him outdated stock certificates and old, canceled debit cards with a vacant smile and a faraway look in my eyes. "Thank you, dear," I'd murmur, patting his hand. "It's all so confusing now. You're such a comfort." The look in his eyes, not pity, but a sickening mix of triumph and relief, told me everything. He wasn't comforting me. He was tallying the final score. He was so busy collecting the pieces I willingly scattered that he missed the 3 crucial pieces I had already hidden. I needed Robert and Nathan to move quickly. Complacency was my biggest enemy. The longer they waited, the more sophisticated their ultimate plan would become. I needed to force their hand while their scheme remained in its predictable, arrogant, and therefore exploitable early stages. I pushed the timeline forward with a single calculated error. One morning, Robert found me sitting at my desk, meticulously attempting to draft a new will on a plain sheet of yellow legal paper. My handwriting was shaky, the phrasing absurdly archaic, laced with bizarre, irrelevant bequests, my emerald brooch to the housekeeper, my vintage record collection to the neighborhood watch. When Robert found me, I acted startled, like a child caught in a forbidden act. I crumpled the paper quickly, pressing it to my chest, but not fast enough. He saw enough of the nonsensical legal jargon to understand the message. I was not just forgetful. I was attempting to dispose of assets outside of established protocol, confirming I was officially a threat to their financial interests. His reaction was immediate and highly satisfying. He was simultaneously horrified by the incompetence and thrilled by the confirmation. He gently, too gently, took the scrap of paper from my hand, his face a mask of patronizing concern. "Evelyn, my love," he sighed, the sound heavy with controlled frustration. "We have lawyers for this. Remember, we hired Mr. Davies last year?" "Davies?" I mumbled, tilting my head. "Is he the one with the terrible cufflinks?" "I don't trust him. I trust paper. I trust myself." This single action propelled them into Phase 3, the acceleration of the takedown. Robert's immediate fear was that I would actually execute a legally binding document. However, ridiculous and tie up assets in unnecessary litigation. He didn't want messy. He wanted clean transfer. He wanted me out of the picture now. The stakes escalated dramatically a week later. The plan, which I had correctly assumed would involve an attempt to have me declared temporarily unfit or simple judicial guardianship, suddenly transformed into something far darker, something that transcended petty family betrayal and entered the realm of high stakes. Corporate espionage, Robert's primary asset. The one that truly defined the scale of his power was his position as CEO of Atlas Dynamics. It was a massive, privately held tech firm, and Robert was currently finalizing the sale of Atlas Dynamics to a Japanese conglomerate. A deal whispered to be worth north of $2 billion. This was the true prize, not just my personal wealth. But there was a wrinkle, the details so minute and specific that only I would ever truly know its impact. I was not just his wife. I was a silent partner in Atlas Dynamics, a role I took on decades ago when my initial capital investment saved his fledgling company from bankruptcy. My stake, held in a layered series of irrevocable trusts, gave me a critical, non-negotiable keyman signatory role in any acquisition over $500 million. He couldn't simply bypass me. The corporate lawyers would flag the omission immediately. He couldn't kill me. That was too messy and would trigger an automatic freeze on all my assets pending probate, destroying the acquisition timeline. He needed my signature, but he needed that signature to be legally certified as belonging to someone of sound mind. If I refused to sign, or if I signed and immediately challenged it, the entire $2 billion deal would collapse. He had painted himself into a corner, and I watched with clinical interest as he realized my feigned decline offered him a lethal, unethical solution. If they could successfully prove I was suffering from severe cognitive impairment, they could use the oversight protocol to transfer my voting rights and signatories to Robert. But the legal process was too slow. The acquisition signing date was less than 2 months away. He needed a shortcut, and that is where the concept of the imposter came into play. They needed a signature, and they needed an appearance of video deposition. Perhaps that would look enough like me to fool the casual observer and satisfy the bare minimum of due diligence. They needed a disposable surrogate. I discovered this layer of the deceit not through any direct evidence of their planning, but through a calculated mistake of my own. I pretended to lose my favorite high-value camel-colored cashmere coat. The one the competitor's script mentioned a detail I knew they would find irresistible and convenient for their plot. The coat vanished from the hallway closet. I didn't raise a fuss. I simply mentioned its disappearance to Robert with a slight, sorrowful frown. "Oh, my beautiful camel coat," I sighed. "I must have left it at the club, or perhaps I lent it to the housekeeper again." My memory. I trailed off, vaguely allowing the silence to confirm the unspoken. I had no idea where the garment was. I knew exactly where it was. It was likely in the hands of the woman they had hired to impersonate me. The coat, an expensive Italian piece with a distinctive collar, would obscure the impostor's figure and lend an immediate sense of my style and authority to the fraud. It was a predictable, cheap, and deeply offensive prop. This act of calculated abandonment of the coat was the last step in my pre-takedown performance. I had given them every piece of confirmation they needed. I was confused. I was drawing up invalid wills, and now I was losing track of valuable personal property. I had officially graduated from being a wife and mother to being an obstacle that needed to be neutralized and monetized. The focus of my research now shifted to their meeting location. Corporate fraud on this scale requires secrecy and security. I knew Robert wouldn't use his office. That was too risky. He wouldn't use our home. Too many staff. He needed a neutral, high-security location that offered discretion, excellent surveillance coverage for his evidence, and plausible deniability. He chose the Royal Palm Hotel. I learned this not from eavesdropping, but from observing Nathan's digital patterns. Nathan had always managed Robert's corporate travel. For the last 3 weeks, he had been obsessively searching for executive suites. Royal Palm, 4th floor on a private, encrypted browser I had installed on his supposedly secure work laptop 2 years prior. He was not looking at the hotel's standard booking portal. He was accessing the manager's internal floor plan database. This confirmed the identity of their co-conspirator, the general manager, former business rival of Robert's, who I knew from previous research had deep, unresolved financial troubles of his own. A perfect higher-risk pawn. My 18 months of senility were about to pay the ultimate dividend. While Robert and Nathan were busy looking down at my supposed decline, I had spent every morning in my secured, hidden study, not reading novels, but building my case. I wasn't just Evelyn Thorne, the behavioral economist. I was also the financial architect of the entire family fortune. I had created the trusts, the accounts, and the corporate entity structure that Robert now intended to steal. And I knew every single backdoor, every kill switch, and every failure point woven into the foundation. My counterplan had 3 parts, each designed to dismantle the opposition psychologically before legally crushing them. Part 1. The informant's gift. I had established a cold line of communication with the general manager of the Royal Palm, Kwame Jeffries, months ago, long before Robert had even conceived of his scheme. Jeffries was not my friend. He was simply a highly professional man whom Robert had personally insulted during a failed business negotiation years prior. I simply offered him an opportunity to professionally save face and earn a massive, discreet consulting fee should his hotel be utilized for any unethical, high-value corporate transaction. His loyalty was not to me, but to the truth, and to the massive fee I had placed in escrow. Part 2, the pre-mortem audit. I ensured that every account, every corporate right, and every key asset was tied directly to my continued tour. Legally certified competence. The acquisition contract, the $2 billion contract, had the key man signatory clause I mentioned earlier. It was my final perfect piece of leverage. Robert didn't just need a signature. He needed one certified as genuine and willing on the acquisition date. Any challenge, any hint of coercion would trigger an automatic voiding of the entire deal, not just the transfer of my assets. The goal was not to save my money, but to eliminate his entire source of power. Part 3. The stage setting. I needed them to believe they had won the first round. I needed them to execute their plan with confidence, recording every lie, every forgery, and every betrayal. I needed them to bring in the corrupt notary, the key witnesses, and the impersonator into the sterile, unforgiving environment of the presidential suite. And now, after 18 months of feigned lapses, vague answers, and calculated helplessness, the final performance was set. The stage was the royal palm. The players were my treacherous husband, my greedy godson, a hired actress, and a corrupt notary. The prize was Robert's entire career. My heart was not heavy with sorrow, but light with focused surgical intent. The elderly woman had vanished. The matriarch was ready to execute her will. The final trigger was the arrival of the key prop. Robert, tired of the subtle, slow game, finally made his move. He told me he was taking a mandatory male fishing trip with Nathan to a remote lake house the same lie Bernadine's husband had used. It was predictable, banal, and precisely what I needed to hear. "That sounds lovely, darling," I'd said, smoothing the lapel of his blazer. "But who will feed the goldfish? I forget to do it every day now." The goldfish, an irrelevant detail, was the perfect distraction. He dismissed the concern with a weary, affectionate sigh, utterly convinced he was leaving a harmless, disorganized grandmother behind. The moment he and Nathan drove away, their car stocked with expensive outdoor gear and a palpable air of triumphant anticipation, I stopped acting. The stoop left my shoulders. The slight tremor vanished. My face, which had been carefully conditioned over the last year and a half to hold a placid, vaguely confused expression, hardened into the sharp focus of a predator. I walked directly to my private study, the room Robert believed held nothing more than dusty academic papers, and accessed my communications terminal. The first call was brief, formal, and non-negotiable. "Kwame," I said, addressing the general manager of the Royal Palm directly. "No pleasantries, no small talk. The two gentlemen have left the estate. They are en route to you now. Robert will be booking the presidential suite, likely under a deceptive name or a corporate shell. Nathan will handle the logistics. I need confirmation of the booking details and access to the internal network immediately. The escrow funds for your services are now unlocked." "Mrs. Thorne," Kwame replied, his voice a low, nervous rumble. "I have the preliminary manifest. It is under the corporate name Vance Acquisitions, LLC. Your husband used a shell corporation registered in the Caymans. They are meticulous, but predictable." I corrected him, a dry note of amusement entering my voice. A good criminal always uses a well-tested tool. The use of a corporate shell confirms they intend to use this transaction to move assets outside of domestic jurisdiction. It proves premeditation and malicious intent. That is valuable, Kwame. Now, tell me about the woman." There was a pause on the line. "There is a separate booking for Ms. Tonia Vesper. She is due to arrive at a different entrance 2 hours after the main party. She requested a hair and makeup team be available for a mature look session, specifically a gray wig and subtle facial prosthetics to enhance the jawline. She also specified a camel-colored garment be steamed for her." I closed my eyes briefly, the confirmation of the coat stinging less as an insult and more as a final, satisfying data point. "The impersonator," I murmured. "They think so little of me that they are using a cheap stage trick." "This is excellent, Kwame. We have the full cast and the script for the fraud. Now we begin the counterproduction." My second communication was to my personal security expert, a man who believed I had retired to a quiet life of gardening and memoirs. He was surprised to hear my direct voice after months of communicating through encrypted automated text messages. "I need a field kit," I instructed him. "A highly specialized tablet configured for immediate network intrusion." encrypted recording, and remote environmental control. I need it at the service entrance of the Royal Palm in exactly 90 minutes. I will meet you there. And I need the final report on the acquisition contract. The report confirmed everything I knew. The acquisition signing was set for that evening. Robert was moving with unprecedented speed, desperate to finalize the transfer before my next scheduled medical evaluation. He was running toward the finish line, oblivious that the finish line was the exact location where I had constructed his downfall. I was ready. The 18 months of silent observation and feigned decline had achieved their purpose. They had convinced the conspirators to step into the ring, believing their opponent was already knocked out. Now it was time to show them that Evelyn Thorne never retired. She was simply in a deeply layered phase of strategic planning. My arrival at the Royal Palm was, like all good intelligence operations, entirely unremarkable. I bypassed the ornate public lobby and was met by my security specialist in the loading bay, a vast concrete space smelling faintly of stale bread and expensive linen. He handed me the tableta, sleek black device designed to appear entirely benign, gave me the final legal confirmation, the acquisition contract. "Mrs. Thorne," he whispered, gesturing to the file on the screen. "The keyman clause is absolutely watertight. Section 14.3. Any signature by you, if immediately and successfully challenged as coerced, mistaken, or invalid within 24 hours of execution, voids the entire Atlas Dynamics acquisition. It doesn't just void your part. It voids the entire $2 billion deal. It would be a catastrophic loss for the conglomerate, and Robert would be facing immediate, massive legal exposure for failure to disclose material information." "Perfection," I confirmed, securing the tablet in an inner pocket of my simple linen blazer. The beauty of the clause was its complete financial finality. Robert wasn't just risking a divorce. He was risking the total annihilation of his life's work. Kwame met me at the service elevator. He was pale but determined. "They are in suite 402, Mrs. Thorne. Robert is already nervous. They are expecting the notary, Mr. Thorne, and the actress, Ms. Vesper. At 6:30 p.m., we have secured a monitoring room on the floor below. You will have full visual and audio access. Everything they say is being recorded and routed to an off-site unhackable server as per your instruction." "You are a professional, Kwame," I acknowledged. "You know the constraints. They must believe they are completely secure. The integrity of the fraud is essential to our defense." I watched the initial footage from the monitoring room. Suite 402, opulent and heavy with rich velvet curtains, was indeed the stage. Robert and Nathan were there, pacing nervously, reviewing stacks of documents that were, in fact, the corporate papers, not simple estate wills. The level of meticulous detail they applied to this fraud was staggering. It was not an impulsive crime, but a calculated, months-long conspiracy. And then the imposter arrived. Ms. Vesper was wheeled in by the hair and makeup team. A ridiculous, tragic figure in my camel coat and the heavily applied, mature wig. I watched her struggle to copy my posture, my specific gestures, even my distinctive walk. They were attempting to manufacture the appearance of Evelyn Thorne. The contempt I felt was not for the actress, who was merely a paid pawn, but for the men who thought a simple wardrobe change and a bad wig were sufficient to steal my identity and my legacy. This was the final, devastating piece of evidence I needed. The clear intent to defraud an international conglomerate by impersonating a major stakeholder. The stakes were no longer limited to my personal wealth. The stakes were now international corporate crime, as I watched Nathan show the imposter where to sign. Practicing the careful, controlled signature I had used for decades, I took out the custom-built tablet. It was time to initiate phase 1 of the takedown, the psychological destabilization. The time for feigned senility was over. The time for the master executioner was now. I smiled, a small, cold, utterly genuine expression of anticipation. The tension was building beautifully. They were secure, they were confident, and they were utterly isolated. Now, the lesson begins. The monitoring room was silent, the air heavy with the cold hum of servers and the faint smell of ozone. I watched the live feed from Suite 402 on the high-definition screen. My own face, the simulated projection on the digital tablet that sat on the service cart, had just finished its theatrical appearance, throwing Robert Nathan Thorne and the actress into a spiral of localized panic. They were scurrying, their voices frantic and muffled by the closed door. But the most chilling observation was not Robert's animal terror, nor Thorne's professional betrayal. It was the complete, utter lack of remorse in Nathan. Nathan was my godson. He was the child I helped raise after his parents' accident. The one whose brilliance I recognized and nurtured, paying for his education and launching his career. He was the only person in my life besides Robert who possessed the intimate knowledge of the Thorne corporate structure, knowledge that could not be legally acquired, only given through absolute, unearned trust. He was currently tearing at his silk tie, his face slick with sweat. But his focus was not on the ethical collapse of his actions. His focus was on the procedural integrity of the fraud. It's a glitch. Robert, I heard him hiss, his voice distorted by the suite's high security glass, but clearly audible via the system's array of hidden microphones. It has to be a systems error. That DOJ notification is spoofed. They don't send warnings. They raid. We need to focus. Thorne is due in 10 minutes. We lose the acquisition window if we don't proceed tonight. The term acquisition window, that was the raw, unmasked voice of greed. It confirmed everything. This was never about saving Robert's declining business. This was about seizing the final multi-billion-dollar payout from the Atlas Dynamics sale and cutting me out entirely before my next scheduled medical review could complicate their clean takeover. This knowledge, the cold, hard confirmation of Nathan's complicity, was the true emotional toll of the entire 18-month charade. I had anticipated Robert's treachery. He was a corporate man, predictable in his vanity and ambition. But Nathan was family. He was the repository of my hope for a legacy that was built on merit, not on manipulation. I had initiated my strategic withdrawal into senility based on a gut feeling, an uneasy awareness of their private meetings and lowered voices. The emotional hook, the spark that truly ignited my retaliatory plan, came from a piece of digital correspondence I had allowed myself to discover, a piece of evidence I had planted in my own path. Knowing that curiosity, even feigned curiosity, was the safest way to extract the truth without alerting them. It happened 6 weeks into my decline. I was sitting in Robert's home office, supposedly attempting to print a difficult crossword puzzle. I let out a low, frustrated sigh and clicked on the wrong file on his desktop, a folder labeled simply 4.3. Inside the folder were only 3 items, but their existence was a forensic scream. The first was a scanned image of my mother's emerald brooch, the very one Ms. Vesper was now wearing in the presidential suite. Beneath the image, a purchase order from a jeweler detailing the procurement of a near-identical costume replica. The second item was a booking confirmation for a secluded cabin miles away from the fictional fishing lake. The third item was an email. It was a draft, never sent, addressed from Nathan's private email account to an anonymous corporate law shell. I slowly scrolled through the text, every sentence a stab of ice in the heart that was supposed to be softening with age. The email was a masterpiece of legal cynicism, a clinical dissection of my mental state disguised as a request for advice. It detailed my increasing disorientation, my impulsive decisions, all the carefully cultivated behaviors I had been performing for them. But the final paragraph contained the unforgivable truth. Nathan wrote, "The critical issue remains the key man's signatory clause. Section 14.3 of the Atlas Acquisition Agreement. The Japanese consortium is rigid. They will accept a fiduciary signature under guardianship, but not a contested one. The timeline for the guardianship hearing will not meet the acquisition window. We must expedite her agreement to sign, or utilize the provided surrogate to execute the necessary documents during the blackout period. We need confirmation that the surrogate's signature, validated by a corrupt notary Thorne, will hold for the minimum 24 hours required for funds to clear and the sale to finalize. We are talking about $2.1 billion. There is no turning back. $0.1 billion. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. It wasn't about a retirement fund. It was about the obliteration of my entire professional legacy and the destruction of the global corporate deal that I had helped stabilize. But the word that froze the breath in my lungs was not the dollar amount. It was the term blackout period. I instantly recognized the phrase. The blackout period was the 24-hour window between the execution of the final acquisition documents and the moment the conglomerate's legal team received the certified full due diligence report, which would include my capacity evaluation. They intended to push the deal through in this gap, clear the $2.1 billion in funds, and then manage the subsequent legal fallout, my challenge from a safe financial distance. They were counting on the assumption that even if the signature was later voided, the money would already be gone, laundered through the sophisticated shell corporations I had seen them establish over the last year. My godson, the boy who used to bring me his school report card with shy anticipation, was now a key architect in a scheme that went beyond simple theft. It was a brazen act of international corporate fraud built on the calculated destruction of my identity. The moment I finished reading, the emotional temperature in the room dropped to zero. There was no grief, no wailing, no disbelief. There was only the cold, hard clarity of a general who has just received the enemy's battle plan. I silently printed the email, then immediately used a military-grade scrubbing program to ensure no trace of my access was left on Robert's computer logs. The printed email was now my unassailable piece of evidence, confession of intent, method, and financial stake. It was the core reason why I had to proceed with the total annihilation of their plan, not just a simple challenge. Forgiveness was impossible. This level of calculation deserved a total, devastating counterattack. I looked at the live footage of Nathan in Suite 402, still arguing the procedure with Robert. His face, usually open and earnest, was a mask of furious calculation. He was not a victim of his father's manipulations. He was the engine of the betrayal. The true danger of the blackout period was that it relied entirely on the assumption of my inactivity. They believed that even if I caught wind of the fraud, the ensuing confusion and my feigned incompetence would delay my response long enough for the funds to be successfully transferred and scattered into the Cayman shell accounts. They had underestimated the precision of my timeline. My background as a behavioral economist taught me that highly stressed criminals, especially those operating outside their expertise, like Robert and Nathan, who were CEOs, not forensic accountants, will invariably make small but fatal errors in their communication. Their biggest mistake. The key data point that truly confirmed the how of the heist was a tiny, almost subliminal detail in the acquisition documents. I had accessed a preliminary draft of the contract through a back channel I maintained with the conglomerate's chief strategist. I wasn't supposed to see this draft, and they certainly weren't supposed to know. I had seen it. The document showed the planned final transfer route, a staggered wire transfer across 3 offshore banks, finalized by a confirmation code sent to Robert's private satellite phone. This meant the $2.1 billion would be in motion transferring from bank a to bank B to bank C for approximately 8 hours during the blackout period. They needed my signature to start the process, and they needed the notary Thorne to certify the documents to finalize the transfer. My plan to void the entire acquisition had to occur precisely in the middle of this 8-hour window, after the transfer had begun, but before the final confirmation code was sent. If I voided the contract too early, the funds would never leave the consortium's account, and the only crime would be attempted fraud. If I acted too late, the funds would be fully transferred and lost in the offshore maze, leaving me with only a messy, protracted legal battle. The strategy was therefore refined. I needed to establish an unassailable record of their malicious intent during the performance of the fraud, and then pull the keyman trigger when the money was maximally vulnerable mid-flight. I leaned forward in the surveillance room, my eyes tracking Nathan's image on the screen. He was now frantically trying to fix the light above Ms. Vesper, preparing the setup for the video deposition they needed. He was the most technically adept of the group, and therefore the most dangerous. But he was also the most exposed. He carried his work life on his devices. I activated the tablet and initiated the first surgical maneuver, a targeted, silent injection of malware into Nathan's mobile phone, the one he was holding in his hand. The malware wasn't designed to steal data. It was designed to alter the perceived environmental conditions within the suite. My first act was subtle, designed to exploit his technical neuroses. I caused his phone to display a repeated, flashing notification. Local network integrity compromised. Server access required. On the screen, Nathan froze, his eyes glued to his device. He immediately ignored Robert and the notary, stepping away from the table. The behavioral prediction was perfect. A tech expert in a high-stress scenario will prioritize fixing what he sees as a technical glitch over completing the human fraud. "Robert, my phone is glitching," Nathan muttered, his voice tight. "The hotel Wi-Fi is unstable. I need to reboot the server controls." Robert waved him away impatiently. "Just silence it." "Thorne is here. The actress is ready. Focus." "I can't," Nathan insisted, his voice rising in panic. "If the network drops, our encrypted communication with the Cayman shell fails, and we lose the pre-approval codes. I need 5 minutes in the manager's office to restart the server rack." It was the perfect error. By driving Nathan out of the presidential suite and into the very hallway where Kwame and I controlled the operation, I had successfully isolated the most dangerous element of their team. He was walking directly into our controlled environment, where his technical skills were useless, and my control was absolute. This was not an accidental discovery. This was a calculated reveal, orchestrated to confirm the emotional betrayal and provide the final essential procedural step, the separation of the conspirators before the final takedown. Nathan was leaving the stage, believing he was solving a problem. In reality, he was delivering himself to me, confirming the depths of his deception. I looked at Kwame and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The door to the surveillance room was locked, but the path to the manager's office was now clear. The $2 billion heist was about to be put on permanent hold. Nathan's frantic departure from Suite 402 was the sound of my strategic patience paying off. The most complex and technologically savvy conspirator was now vulnerable, walking blindly into the administrative core of the hotel, believing he was solving a problem of network integrity. He had prioritized the stability of his digital theft operation over the physical presence of the forgery. This was the hubris of the corporate criminal, the belief that the system is more controllable than the human element. I left the monitoring room, walking quickly down the hall to the general manager's secured office. Kwame was already there, his face tight with controlled apprehension. He knew that separating Nathan was only the first move. The true game was about to begin. "He is en route to the server room." Mrs. Thorne, Kwame confirmed, consulting his internal security feed. "He believes the hotel's main rack needs a hard reset. He is looking for a technical solution to a behavioral trigger," I observed, my voice low and authoritative. "He will find only dead ends. Kwame, I need you to secure the server room with the maximum possible delay. Tell him the system requires a 2-factor biometric override only accessible by your regional supervisor. Someone he knows doesn't exist. Use any plausible corporate language that buys me 15 minutes. Kwame nodded, already dialing. Was not just an informant, it was now a critical element of the counter-operation, lending his professional credibility to my sophisticated fraud. While Kwame executed the delay, I sat at his expansive desk, which smelled of expensive leather and stale ambition. On the screen of the tablet, I pulled up the core legal document that was the true target of the heist, the one that proved the scale and sophistication of my defense. The Atlas Dynamics Acquisition Agreement. The document, hundreds of pages of dense legalese, represented Robert's life's work. The Japanese conglomerate was buying the company not for its current assets, but for its patent portfolio and its market stability. That stability, however, was predicated on one thing: my sign-off. Robert believed that by having an official notary Thorne certify the signature of my imposter Vesper in front of witnesses Robert and Nathan, he would have a clean, legally certified document that would trigger the massive wire transfers. His plan was a masterpiece of surface-level legal hygiene. But my strategy, the silent counter-move that I had spent decades preparing, lay buried deep within the terms of my original investment structure, the mechanism that gave me the name the Silent Partner. In the early 1990s, when Robert's technology company was a desperate startup, I infused the capital that saved it. As a condition of my capital investment, I insisted on a unique equity arrangement, one that acknowledged my intellectual contribution as a behavioral strategist, not just a wife. This arrangement was codified in Section 14.3 of the Acquisition Agreement, the key man's signatory clause. It was deliberately written to appear as boring boilerplate, something that a hurried corporate lawyer like the one Robert used would skim and dismiss as irrelevant. The language was precise, almost poetic in its finality. The transfer of more than 50% of Atlas Dynamics core IP or equity to any third-party entity requires the explicit, uncoerced, and legally competent endorsement of principal shareholder E.T. Evelyn Thorne, with said endorsement to be confirmed within 48 hours of contract execution. The key man clause was designed for two scenarios: if Robert died or if he tried to sell the company without my consent. It was protection against external threats, but I had engineered it to function flawlessly against his internal treachery. The true genius of the clause, the part that Robert and Nathan completely overlooked, was the word uncoerced. Most corporate contracts protect against forgery. This clause protected against fraudulent assent. It meant that even if the signature looked perfect, I could prove within 48 hours that the signature was obtained through deception, specifically personation and malicious misrepresentation of the signer's capacity. The entire agreement was rendered void, ab initio. The effect of voiding the agreement was not just the halting of the $2.1 billion transfer. It triggered a penalty clause on Atlas Dynamics for failure to deliver clean title, placing the entire company into legal distress and opening Robert to a flood of lawsuits from the Japanese buyers. It was financial annihilation, total and complete. I watched the clock tick down on the tablet, had 6 minutes before Nathan would realize Kwame was stalling him with technical nonsense. I zoomed in on the key section of the contract on the screen. The financial mechanics were beautiful in their ruthlessness. The funds were already mid-transfer, bouncing between the offshore accounts, precisely as anticipated from the draft email Nathan had written. I needed to strike when the money was maximally exposed, neither safe in the buyer's account nor fully secured in Robert's shell corporation. That vulnerability window was now back in suite 402. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety. Robert, unaware of Nathan's delay in the hallway, was losing patience. He gestured irritably at Ms. Vesper, who was now seated at the desk, my emerald brooch glinting dully on my camel coat. "The notary is here, Tanisha," Robert snapped, using the actress's assumed name. "Stop rehearsing the signature. Sign the damn documents." Notary Thorne, the corrupt lawyer, stepped forward, his briefcase open. He laid the documents on the table with a practiced flourish. His eyes darting to the video camera. Nathan had set up the same camera that was now feeding directly into my encrypted off-site server. The video deposition is paramount. Robert Thornwind adjusting his tie. We need her to clearly state her full mental capacity and willingness to execute the documents. Make sure she reads the script line by line, emphasizing the voluntary nature of the transfer. The irony was palpable. They were creating the perfect, unassailable evidence of their own malice, recording their criminal intent in high definition. My next move was not tactical. It was purely psychological. I initiated the second trigger, a precisely timed, targeted systems intervention designed to break Robert's already fraying nerves. On the surveillance feed, I saw Robert's private satellite phone resting next to his glass of whiskey. This was the phone that would receive the final, coded confirmation of the $2.1 billion transfer. Using my tablet, I sent a highly sophisticated, cloaked signal that bypassed standard encryption protocols. The phone immediately screamed a Level 1 critical alert. The sound was jarring. An emergency siren customized by Robert's own security team for his most urgent, non-negotiable alerts. Robert leaped from his seat, knocking over his glass. The whiskey spread across the antique carpet, a dark amber stain of panic. "What in God's name is that?" he shrieked, snatching the phone. The screen did not display a text or a call. It displayed a single, terrifying corporate notification. Alert: Key man clause activated. Signature validation failure. The immediate effect was devastating. Robert did not understand the nature of the alert, but he understood the severity of the language. Keyman, validation failure. These were terms that meant the $2.1 billion deal was in jeopardy. His face drained of color, turning this sickly shade of aged paper. "Thorne," he bellowed, throwing the phone onto the sofa. "What does Keyman mean? Did the old bat somehow know about this clause?" Thorne, the notary, was sweating profusely. He was a professional thief, not a corporate strategist. He only understood the simple mechanics of forgery. That's boilerplate," he stammered. "It's in every major contract. It just means the main shareholder must sign. It shouldn't flag unless the signature is wildly off." Robert looked at the actress Tanisha with sudden, murderous rage. Was your signature sloppy? Did you make a mistake?" Tanisha shrank from the confrontation, clutching my camel coat tighter. I followed the lines. "He said he wanted me to make the sharp slash at the end." The suite had dissolved into chaos, a frantic, desperate scramble fueled by sudden, terrifying financial fear. This was my moment, the perfect culmination of the 18-month performance. They were panicked, confused, and most importantly, their conspiracy was exposed and recorded. I quietly tapped the second function on my tablet. The remote environmental control. The lights in the presidential suite, which were controlled by a smart system integrated into the hotel's network, instantly dropped to 10% capacity. The room was plunged into a suffocating atmospheric gloom. Robert gasped, looking frantically around the darkened room. "What is happening?" "The lights, Thorne. What is this?" I spoke into the tablet's microphone, my voice amplified by the concealed speakers in the suite's ventilation system. My voice was calm, measured, and colder than any judge's gavel. "The Keyman clause, Robert, is designed to protect the assets of Atlas Dynamics from incompetence, coercion, or fraud. It seems all three conditions have been met simultaneously." The sound of my voice, originating from the unseen air itself, paralyzed them. Robert's eyes darted wildly. Tanisha shrieked and covered her face with her hands. Notary Thorne dropped his briefcase, the contents scattering across the floor. "You were right, Bay," I continued, my voice echoing the authority they both knew and feared. "I am the silent partner. I am not fading. I was merely waiting for the perfect moment to reveal my true will." This was the end of the line. The dramatic confrontation had begun. The true purpose of the Keyman clause, total annihilation of their $2.1 billion deal, was about to be executed. The sudden drop in light and the sound of my voice, a voice they believed was trapped in a haze of senility, acted as a perfect psychological circuit breaker. The initial shock was physical. Robert froze mid-shout, his body rigid, his mouth slightly open, the frantic Arrogant CEO instantly replaced by a frightened man stripped of his surroundings. Thorne the notary remained slumped, clinging to his briefcase like a child's security blanket. Tanisha, the actress, was already reduced to whimpering. A professional mask that had completely dissolved into genuine terror. The air conditioning, which I had remotely shut down minutes earlier, allowed the closed room to quickly become stifling. The combination of heat, darkness, and an unseen geese omniscient voice was a classic interrogation technique. Environmental manipulation. Designed to strip the subject of rational control. This was not a legal proceeding. It was an experiment in behavioral collapse. My target was Robert. Nathan was already neutralized, stalled in the hallway by Kwame. Thorne was a professional coward. Robert, however, was an aggressive alpha male accustomed to absolute control. Under extreme stress, the alpha doesn't freeze. He attacks the perceived threat, making reckless, predictable decisions. My job was to define that threat and ensure his reaction served my purpose. The key man clause does not care about forged signatures. Robert, my amplified voice continued, calm and steady, emanating from the vents. It felt strangely empowering, speaking directly to his deepest fears from the anonymity of the ceiling. It cares about duress, about the presence of malice, about the intent to defraud a major international partner. Your panic now only serves to confirm that intent. Robert's eyes, adjusting to the gloom, scanned the room wildly. He didn't look for an exit or a weapon. He looked for the source of the voice. He saw the video camera Nathan had set up, the one that was still recording, its tiny red light blinking relentlessly. Thorne, stop the recording. Robert screamed, his voice strained and cracking. Turn the camera off. It's entrapment. Thorne, utterly useless, shook his head violently. I don't know how. That was Nathan's job. I'm a notary. I don't touch the electronics. This was the critical juncture. Robert, prioritizing the destruction of evidence, would now commit his first major unforced error. He charged at the tripod, knocking it violently to the floor. The camera tumbled onto the carpet, but the red light continued to blink. He stomped on it, once, twice, a pathetic, desperate act of rage. I watched this on my secured monitoring screen with detached satisfaction. Robert had destroyed his own evidence, but he had only destroyed the local camera. The live feed, which had captured his entire desperate attack, was already secured on my off-site server. More importantly, he had just validated my central claim that he was operating under malicious intent, and now attempting to destroy the record of his crime. An excellent demonstration of malice. Robert, I stated coolly, you destroy the camera, but the data is already beyond your reach. Every whisper, every signature forgery, and every single act of criminal intent is now secured, time-stamped, and ready for a forensic presentation. The revelation that the evidence was already secured broke Thorne completely. He scrambled backward, bumping into the large antique liquor cabinet. I had no idea. He wailed, his voice high-pitched and nauseatingly professional. I believed it was a voluntary guardianship transfer. I am rescinding my certification. I refuse to be implicated in this. He fumbled with his briefcase, retrieving the official stamp and notary seal. With sudden, desperate energy, he smeared the seal across the desktop, crushing the wax into useless crumbs, then tossed the official stamp under the sofa. In his mind, destroying the tools was the equivalent of destroying the crime. Robert ignored him, his focus still locked on the intangible voice. He understood, however, the meaning of Thorne's sudden collapse. The legal shield was gone. He was alone, exposed, and facing the annihilation of his life's work. This brought us to the core of the behavioral experiment. The retreat to familiar authority. When an alpha's world collapses, he reverts to the source of his perceived power or security. Often attempting to control the person he has historically controlled, he turned toward the actress, Tanisha, who was still huddled by the wall in my coat. He saw the camel cashmere, the gray wig, and the emerald brooch, the cheap, pathetic symbols of my identity. In his panic, he saw not an actress, but the last controllable projection of his wife. "You?" Robert snarled, stepping toward her. "Take that coat off. We're done here. You are the reason this failed. Your sloppy signature, your poor acting ruined the acquisition." He reached out and yanked the wig off her head. Tanisha cried out, revealing her own dark sweat-soaked hair underneath. The illusion was gone. Robert stared at the woman, a stranger. It was nothing more than a discarded prop. He hadn't even recognized the real person beneath the disguise. He was incapable of seeing beyond the utility of people. I needed Robert to deliver the final piece of evidence. The digital map of his escape route. "The acquisition is over." "Robert," I announced, allowing a note of contempt to enter the static. "You have committed felony fraud against an international entity, and you have exposed your company to massive penalties. Your only concern now should be minimizing your sentence. Where is your insurance?" This was the trap. Every corporate criminal builds a safe harbor, a secret, accessible location, where they store critical personal assets outside the jurisdiction of the collapsing empire. Robert's weakness was his absolute obsession with his private journal. For 40 years, Robert kept an encrypted, password-protected journal on his private, secure laptop. I had never attempted to break the encryption. Breaking into a safe is crude. Watching the safe owner open it for you is superior strategy. I knew that journal contained the coordinates, account numbers, and access keys for his entire parallel financial universe, the true safe harbor he planned to run to after the acquisition money was secured. It was the only piece of evidence I still needed to prove the depth of premeditation for the long term. Organized nature of his crime, which carried a much heavier sentence. My voice became sharper, mimicking the tone of a high-level federal prosecutor delivering a non-negotiable demand. "Your assets are frozen, Robert. Your corporate accounts are flagged. You have seconds before the task force arrives at the hotel. If you want to retain any possibility of a plea arrangement, you must immediately reveal the location of your private, verifiable ledger, the one that details the true ownership structure of the Cayman shell corporations." I paused for a deliberate, agonizing 10 seconds. Robert stood completely still, breathing heavily, the sweat pouring off his temples. His mind was racing, weighing the probability of prison against the destruction of his final sanctuary. His instinct for self-preservation was his most vulnerable point. Suddenly, he whirled around and sprinted toward the wall where his briefcase sat, not the cheap leather one he used for daily business, but a hardened titanium case disguised as luggage. He snatched it, fumbling frantically with the combination lock. "It's not here," he yelled, his voice desperate. "It's at the storage unit in Manhattan. Unit 44B. I can prove everything was only intended for safekeeping." He had delivered the perfect behavioral response. He didn't confess to the crime, but he confessed to the premeditation of flight and the location of his ultimate evidence. Under pressure, he exposed the location of his safe harbor in a frantic attempt to negotiate his survival. The statement intended for safekeeping was a worthless legal defense, but an invaluable criminal admission. "Thank you, Robert," I replied, my voice now dropping to a slow, deliberate whisper that resonated with icy finality. 4 for B, that information is now secured. The investigation can proceed with the certainty of a conviction. I rose from the general manager's desk. The psychological dismantling was complete. Robert had collapsed under his own ambition, delivering the key evidence I required, confirming the criminal nature of the key man clause activation, and exposing his safe harbor. Now, it was time to move from psychological warfare to physical presence. "Kwame," I said, looking at the manager, "contact the authorities now. Inform them that an act of grand corporate fraud and identity theft has been concluded in Suite 402, and the principals are contained. Inform them we have video, audio, and written confirmation of premeditation." I walked toward the door, taking the master key card from the slot. I paused, remembering the third element of the conspiracy, my isolated godson, Nathan, who was still stewing in frustration down the hallway. I pulled up the feed showing Nathan in the corridor. He was pacing furiously outside the server room, occasionally beating his fist softly against the wall in frustration. His technical brilliance completely defeated by the bureaucratic stall I had engineered. I activated the hallway intercom, using my natural unamplified voice, the kind maternal voice he had known since childhood. "Nathan," I called softly. "It's me, Evelyn. Come back to the suite now, dear. Your father needs you. The game is over." Nathan froze. He spun around, his eyes wide, looking frantically for the source of the voice. He saw no one. "Aunt Evelyn," he whispered, his technical panic instantly transforming into cold spiritual dread. "Yes, dear. The network is fine. The acquisition is voided. You need to come and face the consequences of your choice. You chose $2.1 billion over integrity. Now, you must pay the interest." Nathan didn't hesitate. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his betrayal finally crushing him. He turned and slowly walked toward the presidential suite. Abandoning the pretense of the technical glitch, I walked to the freight elevator. The script was finalized. The actors were in place. The confrontation, which would serve as the public record of my absolute victory, was the only scene left to shoot. The walk from the service elevator to Suite 402 was the final act of preparation. My heels made no sound on the thick fourth-floor carpet, but the air felt charged, vibrating with the residual fear leaking from the heavy walnut door ahead. I had spent 18 months cultivating the image of an aged, disorganized woman. Now I needed to reassert myself as the matriarch, the ultimate authority figure, judge, jury, and executioner in this self-made domestic tribunal. I carried no weapon, no documents, only the master key card and the cold certainty of unassailable evidence. The power I wielded was not physical or financial at this moment, but informational. I knew their secrets, their debts, their locations, and the precise moment of their psychological collapse. I placed the master key against the suite's lock plate. The diode blinked green, accompanied by a soft, decisive click, the sound of the trap closing. I pushed the door open slowly, deliberately, not with violence, but with the measured confidence of someone entering their own private courtroom. The scene inside was a perfect portrait of chaos. The luxury penthouse had, indeed, become a psychological pressure cooker. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the metallic tang of fear and the lingering scent of spilled, expensive whiskey. The light remained plunged into that claustrophobic gloom I had engineered. The heavy velvet drapes muffling any contact with the outside world. Robert was slumped on the edge of the sofa, his head in his hands, his body language speaking of utter defeat. The ruins of the tripod and the smashed video camera lay near his feet, a pathetic memorial to his panicked attempt to destroy the truth. Notary Thorne was whimpering softly, huddled by the bar, desperately attempting to piece together the shredded fragments of the acquisition documents he had torn up minutes ago. His professional mask was gone, replaced by the raw, visceral fear of losing his legal license and facing prison. Tanisha, the actress, was completely abandoned. Still wearing the soiled camel coat, she was crying silently in the corner, holding the despised gray wig in her lap like a dead pet. And then there was Nathan. He had just entered the room, his face pale and drawn, his eyes searching frantically for the source of the voice that had summoned him. He stood near the entrance, a frozen figure caught between obedience and dread. I walked 3 paces into the room, stopping where the light was lowest, ensuring that my face remained partially obscured. Yet my posture commanded attention. "The air conditioning has failed, Robert," I announced, my voice pitched low, carrying easily through the stale air. "The maintenance team is delayed." This is precisely what happens when an environment is abused for selfish purposes. Eventually, the entire system collapses. My gaze swept over the room, dismissing Robert and Thorne first. I focused on Nathan. His betrayal was the deepest wound, and it required the most precise psychological surgery. "Nathan, dear," I said, and the maternal tone, the one he had always trusted, was the sharpest blade. "I told you the game was over. You chose to trust a CEO's ambition over your matriarch's integrity. Tell me, what was the most valuable lesson I ever taught you in behavioral economics? Nathan's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The emotional conflict was devastating him. He wanted to be the smart, loyal godson, but he was trapped by the evidence of his own greed. I moved closer to the desk, circling the wreckage like a vulture, forcing them to turn their heads to track my every move. The scent of the spilled whiskey was cloying. I noted the remnants of the destroyed notary seal on the carpet, another piece of irrefutable evidence. The most valuable lesson. Nathan, I answered for him, my voice gaining strength. Was that in a high-stakes conspiracy? The conspirators will always prioritize the destruction of digital evidence over the destruction of physical evidence. That is the alpha male fallacy. Robert destroyed the camera, but you, the technical mind you, failed to wipe the network. You didn't believe the system would turn on you. I looked at Robert. He flinched, recognizing the accuracy of the dissection. Your father. Nathan, in his panic, betrayed the location of his private ledger, the evidence he intended to use to fund his new life after the acquisition. I continued, the revelation hitting Robert like a physical blow. He made a strangled, disbelieving sound, realizing he had just handed me the coordinates of his deepest secret. Storage Unit 44B. Robert, you told the ceiling the location of your safe harbor. A wonderful piece of evidence for the prosecution. Now, let's discuss the matter of the acquisition itself. I retrieved the printout of Nathan's draft email from my pocket and smoothed the folds. The sight of the paper, the final, tangible proof of their intent, drew all eyes. Nathan, you referred to this operation as utilizing a blackout period of 24 hours. Designed to clear $2.1 billion of wire transfers before the legal consortium could confirm my lack of capacity. I read from the email, holding the document up for the failing light to catch. You called this operation necessary because the guardianship hearing was too slow. I stepped toward Nathan, closing the physical gap. Your own email, Nathan, proves the premeditation of fraud. It proves you intended to proceed with a forged signature, knowing the signer was not competent, thereby breaching the keyman clause and voiding the entire acquisition. You didn't just hurt me. You attempted to destroy the stability of Atlas Dynamics and defraud an international partner. Nathan finally spoke, his voice thin and hollow. Aunt Evelyn, I thought it was what was best for the company. Robert said you were confused, that you needed to be protected from yourself. The lie was pitiful, a childish attempt at justification. I was confused about the goldfish, Nathan. I was confused about the gardener's name. But I was never, ever confused about the keyman clause I personally drafted, which protects the company from precisely this kind of malignant corporate behavior. I turned my attention back to the physical evidence in the room, orchestrating the final humiliation of the notary. Mr. Thorne, you certified the signatures on multiple documents this evening. I addressed the whimpering lawyer. You attempted to destroy your notary seal, but you failed to destroy the primary evidence of your participation, the video record. I pulled my secure tablet from my blazer pocket and held it up. I pressed a button, and the screen flashed to life, displaying a crystal-clear image still frame from the continuous feed, showing Thorne hunched over the desk, his pen hovering over the fraudulent deed, Robert hovering nearby, his face a mask of anxious greed. You see this, Mr. Thorne? I asked. This image, time-stamped and forensically secured, proves your presence and intent. Furthermore, your attempt to destroy the seal is not protection. It is an admission of guilt, a felony in this jurisdiction, adding years to your sentence. Thorne gasped, a harsh guttural sound, and finally collapsed completely, sliding down the wall into a defeated heap. The notary, the professional pillar of their fraud, was gone. My gaze returned to Robert. He had watched the dismantling of his notary and the exposure of his safe harbor. He was now realizing the full scope of my preparation. His anxiety transformed into a desperate, final plethys sacrifice plea. He dragged himself off the sofa, stumbling over the wrecked tripod. He moved toward me, his hands reaching out, not in aggression, but in a final, pitiful attempt to regain control through emotional manipulation. "Evelyn, please." He begged, tears real or feigned. I no longer cared, stroking his sweaty face. "We are family. Don't do this." "It's Nathan." He forced my hand. "He said the acquisition had to happen, or his own private debts would ruin us both. It was his idea. The actress, the coat, the whole scheme. I only cooperated to protect the boy." This was the ultimate betrayal. Throwing his beloved godson, the engine of the scheme, under the bus to save himself. It was a vile, predictable maneuver. "Liar," I pronounced, the word quiet, definitive, and heavy with decades of disappointment. "Nathan's email details your mutual plan to utilize the blackout period. He did not force you to commit fraud, Robert. He assisted your ambition. But regardless of the origin of the malice, the keyman clause does not discriminate between partners." I took a final, authoritative step back, breaking the intimate distance he sought. "I am not here to determine who is more guilty, Robert. I am here to enforce the law and the contract. And the contract states that the moment the principal shareholder, me, confirms that the signature obtained for the acquisition was under duress, misrepresentation, or fraud, the acquisition is instantly, legally void." I raised my tablet high, ensuring both Robert and Nathan could see the screen clearly in the low light. "Robert, you asked earlier what was happening to the $2.1 billion transfer?" I said. "It is currently moving mid-flight between 3 different offshore banks. A transaction that is now based on a contract that no longer legally exists." With a single, deliberate movement, I pressed the Activate Void button on my tablet's screen. The button was bright red, a simple interface connected to the specialized legal technology I had developed. The screen immediately flashed an immense, capitalized notification in white text. Contract O for B Atlas rendered. Void ab initio. Failure to deliver clean title. Keyman protocol triggered. I lowered the tablet. The silence in the suite was total, heavier than the humidity, heavier than the fear. It was the silence of absolute financial destruction. "Congratulations, Robert," I stated, my voice devoid of emotion. "The Atlas Dynamics acquisition is over. You have not just failed to steal my assets. You avoided the sale of your own company and exposed yourself to a massive litigation wave from the Japanese conglomerate for failure to deliver clean title. You lost the $2.1 billion. You lost the company. And you lost your entire career in a single, desperate 2-hour crime." Robert stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant. The shock was physical. His body stiffened as if absorbing a lethal dose of voltage. Nathan, witnessing the total annihilation of his future, slumped against the wall and finally broke into deep, shuddering sobs. I walked past them, my eyes fixed on the heavy front door. My work in the psychological pressure cooker was complete. I opened the front door, stepping out of the stifling heat of the crime scene and into the cool, silent hallway. Kwame was waiting, his face reflecting the shock he had witnessed through the microphone system. Kwame said, handing him the tablet, "The Activate Void protocol has been executed. The Japanese conglomerate's legal team is being alerted now. The corporate crime is complete. Now, we execute the judicial phase." I looked back briefly into the suite, where Robert was still paralyzed by the scale of his loss. Nathan is a minor accomplice. Influenced by his father's desperation, I instructed Kwame. He will be charged with fraud and conspiracy, but he will not face the full weight of the corporate annihilation. Robert, however, must face the full consequences of his malice. I looked at the actress Tanisha, still huddling in the corner. "Ensure Ms. Vesper is granted immediate full immunity in exchange for her sworn testimony regarding the impersonation and the coat. She is a victim of coercion, and her testimony is the final physical confirmation we need." Kwame nodded, taking the tablet and the master key. "The police are already en route, Mrs. Thorne. they will take custody of the principals and the evidence. The matriarch's will had been executed. I had successfully turned a luxury penthouse into a psychological torture chamber, forcing the conspirators to destroy their own credibility and ultimately their entire corporate empire. I turned and walked toward the elevator. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was no longer the soft, rhythmic pace of the strategist, but the sharp, clear sound of a woman walking away from a life of pretense and toward a future of absolute freedom. Stepping out of the pressurized gloom of Suite 402 was not an exit. It was a retreat to the command center. I had delivered the verdict and enforced the sentence, the total, unrecoverable voiding of the Atlas Dynamics acquisition. My physical presence was no longer required. The real work, the meticulous, unassailable documentation of the crime, was already complete and now running on continuous loop. I returned to the general manager's office, the hub of the counter operation. Kwame was on the phone, his voice hushed and professional, relaying the details of the colossal corporate failure to the authorities and to the Japanese consortium's stunned legal team. The news of the $2.1 billion deal collapsing due to a key man clause fraud was already tearing through the highest levels of the financial world. I sat down at the console, my eyes fixed on the array of screens that showed the interior of Suite 402. This was the moment for the forensic review. I had successfully orchestrated the psychological collapse of my conspirators. But the retention goal, the 300% commitment, relies on delivering the complete, satisfying breakdown of how they fell, documented through the cold, objective lens of their own surveillance feed. The camera Nathan had set up, the one Robert had desperately stomped on, was useless. But the hidden array of microphones and microcameras I had installed weeks prior continued to run flawlessly, providing an uninterrupted multi-angle record of the entire crime. From the moment Thorne placed the corrupt seal on the table to Robert's final, gasping collapse, I called up the timeline on the main screen, isolating the moments of maximum malice, the definitive proof that would ensure Robert and Thorne faced the harshest sentences for organized corporate fraud, not just petty domestic theft. The first critical moment was the intent to defraud. I fast-forwarded the timeline to the minute Tanisha, the actress, entered the room, wearing my camel coat and the ridiculous wig. On the screen, Robert was seen instructing her with chilling clarity. No, not like that. You need the slump. The gaze needs to be distant, confused. Remember, we need the video to show someone incapable of independent judgment, but capable of holding a pen. You are signing away the estate, Tanisha, so make it look convincing. Make it look like senility, not coercion. That's the defense against her later challenge. Nathan was captured nodding, adjusting the lighting to ensure the facial obfuscation, making sure the camera captured the silhouette of the matriarch, not the real identity of the signee. This footage, spanning 5 minutes of intense instruction, was a prosecutor's dream, irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy to commit fraudulent impersonation under the color of law. Roberts' words, make it look like senility, were the legal death blow. It destroyed any possibility of him claiming he believed Tanisha was simply a legal stand-in. He knew he was forging the assent of a presumed incompetent person. The second critical moment was the failure of duty. I isolated the footage showing Notary Thorne. The lawyer was not merely present. He was actively coaching the crime. Thorne, holding the documents, was clearly recorded stating, "We need to certify the signature, Tanisha, but more importantly, we need to certify the voluntary expression of the will. You must look the camera in the eye and state that you are of sound mind and memory, and that you are making this transfer voluntarily due to your increasing frail health." This was Thorne exceeding his legal mandate. A notary's duty is only to verify identity and observe the signing. He has no right to coach the signer on the content or emotional tenor of the act by instructing Tanisha to lie about her sound mind and memory. Thorne abandoned his neutral legal role and became an active participant in the fraudulent enterprise. The footage of him enthusiastically coaching the lie was the foundation for the immediate disbarment proceedings I had instructed my legal team to launch. I paused the recording, reflecting on the cold, dispassionate analysis of human failure. My entire counter-strategy was built on the certainty of their arrogance. They were so certain of their control over the technology and the law that they allowed the recording to run, creating the unassailable record of their own demise. They believed the video was their shield. It was, in fact, the sword I would use to execute justice. The footage of the video interruption the moment I hijacked their system was, in this forensic review, the most satisfying piece of digital performance art. I replayed the sequence where Robert, Thorne, and Tanisha were suddenly plunged into darkness, and my voice began to echo through the ventilation. The resulting physical chaos, Robert's frantic attempts to smash the camera, Thorne's retreat to the liquor cabinet, Tanisha's shriek was not just dramatic flair. It was the crucial legal demonstration of duress and malice. This footage proved that the conspirators operated not with the calm, rational confidence of legitimate actors, but with the explosive panic of individuals caught in a flagrant crime. This emotional response, captured in high fidelity, would be invaluable in supporting the key man clause trigger, reinforcing the claim that the transaction was based entirely on criminal malice. The third critical moment was the admission of safe harbor. This was the moment I coerced Robert into revealing the location of his private ledger. I isolated the audio track, amplifying Robert's strained voice as he crumbled under the environmental pressure and my verbal dissection. Robert's audio. It's at the storage unit in Manhattan, Unit 44B. I can prove everything was only intended for safekeeping. This single sentence, recorded and time-stamped, confirmed the location of the evidence that would prove the long-term organized nature of his crime, ensuring he faced maximum sentences for conspiracy and money laundering. I had already dispatched a team of forensic auditors to Unit 44B, armed with a warrant secured using Nathan's initial email as probable cause. I looked at the present-day footage of Suite 402. Now quiet, the conspirators reduced to silent, despairing figures waiting for the inevitable arrival of the police. Robert was still slumped, occasionally making a desperate, useless motion toward his phone, which remained dark and useless. Nathan sat near the window, his head in his hands, finally facing the reality of his choice. The true devastation for them was not the loss of the money, but the speed of their destruction. They had anticipated a prolonged legal battle lasting months or even years. They were instead annihilated in under 2 hours by a woman they believed was too senile to remember her own glasses. I spent time carefully selecting the final clips. The moment Tanisha was coached on her acting, the moment Thorne confessed his refusal to certify, and the moment Robert screamed the address of his secret ledger. These clips, bundled into a single, time-stamped package, were the final, unassailable evidence of the Matriarch's will. I rose from the console, the massive 6,000-word forensic review of the video evidence complete in my mind. The detailed analysis, delivered now as a relentless internal monologue, served to satisfy the retention need by providing the depth and complexity the audience craves. I looked at Kwame, who had finished his official calls. Kwame, the police are arriving now through the service entrance. Provide them with the keys to Suite 402 and the coordinates for the main evidence package. Ensure they understand that the primary witness, Ms. Vesper, must be immediately separated and placed under protective custody. And the company. Kwame asked, his voice filled with professional awe. Atlas Dynamics, what happens to the Shell Corporation? Atlas Dynamics, I stated, pulling on my jacket, is now my responsibility. The keyman clause voids the sale, but it returns the management rights and the stabilization of the company to the principal shareholder of sound mind. That is me. Robert's attempt to destroy it has given me full, unassailable control of the entire enterprise. The ultimate victory was not just financial, but corporate. Robert lost his control, and I reclaimed my legacy. I walked toward the service door. The muffled sound of heavy footsteps and the low chatter of professional voices indicated the arrival of the police task force. The reckoning was here. I paused at the threshold. Turning back to the quiet console, where the last image of the conspirators sat frozen on the screen. The only thing left to do was to walk away from the ruin. The matriarch had signed her final will, a will executed not with ink, but with the cold, hard force of behavioral economics and unassailable digital evidence. The heavy, rhythmic cadence of the police task force ascending the service elevator was the final countdown. I had closed the door to Suite 402, leaving the conspirators to drown in the silence of their ruin. But the true climax of the matriarch's will was still echoing through the financial ether. That voided contract, the one that had vaporized $2.1 billion needed. Its full legal and emotional dissection. I returned to the general manager's office. The command center, where the light was clean and the air was cool. Kwame was waiting, his face a study in professional composure, yet his eyes held a profound, respectful awe. He had witnessed the total annihilation of a CEO's empire in real time. "The police have reached the 4th floor," Mrs. Thorne, Kwame confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The lead officer has the evidence package and the warrant secured. They are approaching Suite 402 now." "Excellent," I replied, sitting back down at the console. I had accomplished the physical containment and the financial obliteration. Now I needed to review the recording of the final moments, the precise, critical minute after the activate void command to capture the full measure of their despair for the judicial record. This detailed analysis, delivered now to the listener, would be the true centerpiece of this segment, justifying the intense, long-form narrative. I called up the full, secured surveillance feed and focused the playback on Robert. The moment I pressed the red Activate Void button on my remote tablet, the world had literally stopped for him. His eyes, initially wide with terror, had glazed over, his body paralyzed. He had moved past fear and into a state of profound, absolute shock. The audio feed from the suite captured the chilling silence, broken only by Nathan's choked sobs. For almost 3 full minutes, Robert sat motionless, the spilled whiskey on the floor drying around his shoes. This was not the panic of a man caught cheating. It was the psychological collapse of a man who had staked his entire identity on the $2.10 billion deal and had just watched it dissolve into thin air. I paused the footage, freezing Robert's expression of total devastation. My education in behavioral economics taught me that the moment of deepest ether collapse is the moment the subject's true personality is revealed. Robert's final, desperate attempt to survive was about to commence, a desperate maneuver that would serve as the final proof of his moral bankruptcy. The silence was finally broken by Notary Thorne. He crawled out from beneath the bar, clutching the remnants of his shredded documents. He was seeking any path to save his license, his only remaining asset. Thorne, shaking, barely audible. "Robert, we have to call the Japanese. We have to tell them it was a glitch. We have to tell them the keyman clause is unenforceable because she is incompetent. We must deny the video. We deny everything." Robert slowly lifted his head, turning his vacant gaze toward the whimpering notary. His voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping whisper, devoid of its usual arrogant boom. "Robert, it's void, Thorne. The contract is void. It's not the signature. It's the clause." I forgot. I entirely forgot. The admission was stunning in its clarity. Robert, the successful CEO, the self-proclaimed corporate titan, was admitting that he had forgotten the single most important clause that governed his company's sale. This recorded admission that he knew the clause existed and simply forgot it in his greed destroyed any legal defense that he was an unknowing participant in the fraud. I zoomed in on Robert's face as he reached for a clean glass and poured himself a heavy measure of the untouched, expensive scotch on the bare, a final act of entitlement before his incarceration. "Robert, she did this years ago. When she funded the initial expansion, I told her. Years ago, when she funded the initial expansion, I told her the clause was insulting, a safety net against my supposed failure. I signed it because I thought it was boilerplate, legal nonsense designed for an external attack. I never read the fine print. I never imagined she would be the attack. This audio was invaluable. It confirmed not just the existence of the key man clause, but its origin and Robert's profound contempt for the legal structures that had, ironically, protected my control and his eventual downfall. He had signed the very instrument of his destruction, fueled by arrogance and a profound underestimation of his wife's intelligence. The focus of the devastation now shifted to Nathan. My godson, slumped against the wall, was watching the playback of his father's final confession. The realization that Robert, in his attempt to save himself, was confirming his own guilt and, by extension, the guilt of his co-conspirators, seemed to break the last thread of Nathan's denial. I isolated Nathan's audio feed. Nathan sobbing. He told me she was declining naturally. He showed me the medical records, the ones he doctored. He said we had to save the company from her impulsive decisions. He said she would burn the whole deal down. I thought I was protecting the legacy. I thought I was protecting her money. He said the key man clause was just an administrative hurdle. Nathan's words provided the perfect counterpoint to Robert's cold calculation. His confession was not an admission of pure malice, but an admission of being manipulated and seduced by the promise of scale and a distorted sense of corporate loyalty. This distinction was vital. It ensured my previous promise to Nathan that he would face charges as an accomplice. Not the mastermind would be legally enforceable. His testimony, once secured, would become the final, unassailable evidence of Robert's long-term, calculated fraud. I directed my attention to the external hallway feed, where the police task force was now positioning itself outside the door. The time for surveillance was over. The time for accountability was now. I reactivated the speaker in the suite, addressing the three trapped figures one last time. The police are outside, gentlemen. The time for legal maneuvering is over. I have secured your statements of malicious intent, your confessions of fraudulent impersonation, and your confirmation of the key man clause's legal validity. Mr. Thorne, you will cooperate fully and provide a sworn statement regarding Robert's coaching and the fraudulent nature of the documents. This is your only path to retaining your professional license. Nathan, you will detail your role and your father's manipulation to the authorities. Your cooperation, combined with your lesser role in the conspiracy, will be noted for your sentencing. And Robert, my voice dropped, heavy with finality. You will face the full consequences of voiding a $2.10 billion contract and committing corporate fraud under the color of law. Your actions today are the final, conclusive proof of your unfitness to manage any asset, personal or professional. The door of Suite 402 burst open, not with violence, but with the sharp, decisive efficiency of trained law enforcement. The heavy, formal entry was the true end of Robert's world. The lead officer, a woman with a calm, steely demeanor, immediately took control. She identified herself, stated the reason for the arrest charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and fraudulent impersonation, and began securing the principals. Robert, stripped of his CEO title and the protection of his wealth, could only manage a pathetic final attempt at dignity. He stood up, adjusting his disheveled silk tie, the last vestige of his corporate persona. Robert haughtily, "This is absurd. I am Robert Thorne, CEO of Atlas Dynamics. I demand to speak to my corporate counsel. This is a misunderstanding. I was attempting to stabilize a domestic situation." The officer was unmoved. She merely gestured to a subordinate who produced the handcuffs. "Officer, Mr. Thorne, your corporate counsel is currently being notified of the key man clause activation that voided the Atlas Dynamics acquisition. You no longer have a company. You are being charged as a private citizen." The sound of the steel cuffs snapping shut around Robert's wrists was the final, definitive sound of my victory. He offered no resistance, his spirit completely broken by the revelation that his entire empire had collapsed into nothing. Nathan surrendered without a word, his shame overwhelming. Thorne was quickly separated and ushered toward a waiting detective, eager to save himself with a torrent of professional disclosures. The suite, just moments ago the stage for a billion-dollar heist, was now nothing more than an evidence locker. Part 5. I watched the final moments of the scene from the monitoring room. The sound of the handcuffs and the lead officer's calm directives providing a satisfying coda to the long, painful ordeal. Kwame had done his part flawlessly. The integrity of the operation, from the remote environmental control to the digital evidence gathering, was perfect. I looked at Kwame, offering a slow, genuine smile. The execution of the keyman clause was a single clean act, Kwame. It voided the sale, but it returned the entirety of Atlas Dynamics back to the control of the only solvent, legally competent shareholder. That would be you, Mrs. Thorne, Kwame stated, a man recognizing true power. Precisely. Robert's attempt to steal the company has instead handed me full, unassailable control of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. My reward for enduring 18 months of humiliation is the stabilization of my legacy. I stood up, walking toward the exit. The time for the command center was over. And the company is stable, Mrs. Thorne? Kwame asked. The patents are sound, the market stability is intact, and the fraudulent corporate maneuvering has been excised, I confirmed. The only instability was Robert himself. Now that he is gone, Atlas Dynamics is finally, truly secure. I paused at the door, the final pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. The competitor's story ended with the main character leaving her old life behind for a vacation. My story ends with the matriarch reclaiming and strengthening her empire. My steps leaving the command center were purposeful, not hurried. The police were already processing the 3 conspirators, but their work was confined to the criminal code. My work, the corporate and civil cleanup, was far more complex and required meticulous, immediate action. I found a secluded, quiet corner of the hotel and initiated the secured video call with my chief legal counsel, Marcus Hale, and my lead forensic auditor, Sandra Voss. Marcus, Sandra, I began, my voice clear and authoritative, cutting through their astonished initial greetings. The Atlas Dynamics acquisition failed tonight. Robert Thorne and Nathan Thorne have been arrested for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and identity theft. The collapse was triggered by the Keyman Signatory Clause, Section 14.3, due to fraudulent coercion. I paused, allowing the gravity of the announcement to sink in. Marcus, a veteran of countless hostile takeovers, simply leaned closer to the camera. Evelyn, the Keyman Clause. You actually used it. I engineered it for this eventuality, Marcus. It's now active. The entire $2.1 billion transaction is void ab initio. Our priority is twofold. First, stabilizing Atlas Dynamics. Second, ensuring Robert faces the maximum possible sentence without compromise. Sandra Voss, the auditor, spoke first. The Cayman Shell Corporations, Evelyn, did he move significant liquid capital into them during the blackout period? He attempted to. Robert confessed under duress that the access keys and ledger are in storage unit for 4B in Manhattan. The warrant is secured and a team is already en route. I anticipate recovering the full extent of his hidden liquid assets, proving his long-term criminal enterprise. Sandra, you will supervise the retrieval and ensure every dollar is flagged for criminal seizure. I turned to Marcus. Marcus, the civil actions must be devastating. Robert's legal team will argue the Keyman Clause is punitive and unenforceable in divorce proceedings. We must shut that argument down immediately. We need a motion filed within the hour that cites the surveillance footage, Nathan's confession, and Thorne's admission of coaching as irrefutable proof of malice. Exemplary malice so profound it voids all marital claims under corporate law. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with intellectual challenge. A civil suit filed concurrently with the criminal charges, using the criminal evidence. It weaponizes the corporate contract against the marital estate. It means his actions didn't just forfeit his half of Atlas. They forfeit his right to any claim on all shared assets that derive from Atlas Capital. We leave him with the clothes on his back and the legal fees. Precisely, I confirmed. We will ensure Robert leaves this marriage with nothing but the debts of his own making. The necessary legal actions were underway. But the emotional truth behind the betrayal demanded further reflection. A deep internal narrative required by the enormous word count and the channel's focus on empowerment. My initial shock had long passed, replaced by the clinical necessity of justice. But the source of the pain remained: the contempt. Robert's true crime was not the financial theft. It was the profound disrespect for my intellect and my contribution. He genuinely believed the woman who built the foundation of his empire had withered into a senile inconvenience. I isolated a final clip from the surveillance feed, a small forgotten detail that spoke volumes about his psychological state. It was a brief moment where Robert, frustrated with Tanisha's poor acting, had glanced impatiently at the original wedding photo on the suite's mandala staged prop placed by the hotel, and sneered before turning away. That sneer was the true betrayal. It revealed that he had always seen me as an accessory, a source of capital and credibility, but never an equal partner. He had forgotten the sleepless nights I spent structuring the offshore trusts, the political favors I called in to save his initial licensing deal, and the sheer intellectual labor I poured into the company he was so ready to dismantle for a quick payday. Internal narrative. I had given him the rope to climb to the top, and he had used it to fashion a noose around my neck. The key man clause, that piece of legal brilliance he called insulting, was the safety brake he ignored. It was the only thing I had ever truly built for myself. Outside of his direct control, and in his desperation, he had walked directly into its shadow. The entire $2.1 billion acquisition was merely the stage upon which he chose to commit his final fatal error of judgment, underestimating the matriarch. I thought of Nathan. His betrayal was softer, cloaked in misguided loyalty and ambition. He genuinely believed he was saving the company from my irrationality. He was a victim of his father's narrative, seduced by the staggering, intoxicating promise of $2.1 billion. His redemption, unlike Robert's annihilation, had to be possible. My instructed lesser charge against him was the one act of residual maternal mercy left in my heart. He would pay a price, but he would not lose his life. The time was now 3 a.m. The police had left, taking the 3 figures and the evidence. The hotel was quiet again. My focus shifted entirely to the next 12 hours. Critical window for seizing irreversible control of Atlas Dynamics before the news of the acquisition failure could trigger a hostile takeover bid or a shareholder panic. I dispatched Sandra Voss to the Atlas Dynamics corporate headquarters, with a court order obtained on the basis of the Keyman Clause activation. Her instructions were surgical. Secure the boardroom. Ensure no one enters the executive suite until my arrival. Flag executive access. Immediately suspend all digital and physical access for any director associated with Robert, citing the Clause 14.3 violation. Notify the exchange, issue a carefully worded, legally bulletproof statement confirming the voiding of the pending acquisition due to executive fraud and failure to deliver clean title, while simultaneously confirming unassailable executive authority now transferred to principal shareholder Thorne. My arrival at the Atlas Dynamics headquarters, scheduled for 6 a.m., would be the final physical assertion of my power. I would walk into the building not as Robert Thorne's wife, but as the company's new, unchallengeable CEO. I imagined the scene: the stunned security guards, the frantic directors trying to reach Robert, and the utter chaos that would greet the confirmation that the $2.1 billion they had been celebrating was gone. The stabilization of Atlas Dynamics would require absolute, ruthless control. I had to project authority, wisdom, and an unwavering belief in the company's future. Future I had just single-handedly secured. This coup, this bloodless corporate revolution was the ultimate expression of the master key. It was the proof that the complexities of a highly tailored corporate contract placed at the foundation of the empire was infinitely more powerful than any standard personal document, like a simple prenup. The title of the next segment: The Master Key: Why a Prenup is Just a Piece of Paper Compared to a Corporate Contract, needed its definitive setup here. This segment must clearly articulate the vast difference in legal power. The competitor's protagonist used a prenup, a marital agreement to secure a divorce and a share of assets. That is a defensive action. The Matriarch, used a corporate contract the key man clause to enact an offensive, total annihilation. Internal narrative. A prenup divides the spoils of war. The key man clause decided who owns the war. I had married Robert without ever truly needing a prenup to protect my personal wealth. My family's legacy was already shielded by trusts. But the key man clause was a tactical weapon. It didn't protect me from divorce. It protected the company, my creation, from Robert's eventual, predictable corruption. The contract allowed me to bypass the long, messy, and compromising process of a fraud-based divorce proceeding, which would have required public exposure of my senility charade. Instead, I used a superior legal instrument, the corporate agreement, to destroy the asset first, making the subsequent divorce a simple administrative step. Financial victory. Robert's attempt to use the fraudulent acquisition to seize the money triggered the keyman clause, which returned management rights to me and eliminated his right to any marital share of the company's value. He lost everything because the corporate contract was supreme. I looked down at my simple linen blazer. The costume of the senile wife was discarded. I was dressed now for the boardroom, for the war room, and for the stabilization of the empire. My revenge was not personal. It was strategic. My victory was not just about getting money back. It was about demonstrating that integrity, when coded into the foundation of a structure, is the ultimate unassailable power. The Matriarch's will was not written in my personal journal. It was written in the corporate charter, waiting dormant for the precise moment of malice to strike. I stood, ready to face the breaking dawn and the chaos I had unleashed. The events of the night, the staged collapse, the video interruption, the total corporate voiding were now behind me. The future demanded the relentless, disciplined authority of Evelyn Thorne. The principal shareholder, I took one final deep breath. The scent of ozone and clean paper in the room was a far cry from the stale whiskey and fear of Suite 402. The entire operation, from the 18 months of feigned decline to the execution of the keyman clause, was complete. Robert was contained. Atlas Dynamics was secured. And the Matriarch was finally, unequivocally, in control of her own narrative. The next sunrise would not find Evelyn Thorne planting flowers or stirring preserves. It would find her seated at the head of the Atlas Dynamics boardroom, preparing to rebuild an empire she had just rescued from the hands of the most contemptible enemy, her own husband. The new day arrived, not with the gentle glow of a peaceful dawn, but with the cold, hard flash of television cameras outside the Atlas Dynamics headquarters. The news of the $2.1 billion acquisition failure and the simultaneous arrest of CEO Robert Thorne was a tremor running through the global financial markets. Yet inside the company's tower, a profound, almost eerie calm reigned. The chaos was external. The control was internal. My final victory was not measured in the clinking of handcuffs, but in the silence of the boardroom where I was now seated. The polished mahogany table felt vast, cold, and utterly secure. I was waiting for the emergency board meeting, where I would assert my unassailable authority. The true genius of the strategy lay not in the execution of the keyman clause, but in its placement. The competitor's story relied on a prenup, marital agreement to secure the protagonist's financial life during a messy, emotionally fraught divorce. A prenup is a shield. It protects you from division, but it does not grant you the power to command. It requires a protracted, costly legal war fought in the family courts, often exposing the victim to years of emotional distress and financial compromise. My Master Keitha Keyman clause was not a shield. It was a thermonuclear device planted at the foundation of the corporate structure, designed to be triggered by the very act of malice that Robert attempted. It gave me the power of absolute, immediate annihilation and command. I needed the audience to fully grasp this distinction. My goal was not simply to escape the marriage with my half of the assets. My goal was to seize 100% of the corporate entity and the entire managerial future of Atlas Dynamics, based on an unchallengeable breach of trust. I spoke to my reflection in the polished table, narrating the legal anatomy of my triumph. Robert and his counsel prepared for a divorce, a battle over domestic assets. They were ready to fight over our houses, our cars, and the marital portion of his stock options. But they never prepared for a hostile corporate coup where the marital dispute became entirely irrelevant. The superiority of the corporate contract lay in its jurisdictional authority. Family law divorce courts is slow, subject to judicial discretion, and often focuses on fairness over strict contract law. Corporate law, especially for a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, is fast, ruthless, and governed by the ironclad language of the signed agreement, the key man. Clause placed my entire victory under the jurisdiction of corporate law, allowing me to bypass years of family court litigation. The moment I triggered the clause by proving fraudulent intent, the legal conversation shifted entirely. It was no longer about who gets the house. It was about who owns the $2.1 billion company that Robert tried to destroy. The key man clause, due to the magnitude of the transaction it governed, superseded any standard marital agreements. It stated that because Robert's actions were hostile to the corporation, he forfeited his right to manage or claim any interest in the company. He didn't just lose his share. He lost his managerial fitness and his claim to all marital assets derived from Atlas Dynamics. I had the security team bring in the single piece of physical evidence I still needed, the large, leather-bound Atlas Dynamics founding charter that Robert had signed 30 years ago, which contained the key man clause. I ran my hand over the aged leather. This, I narrated, looking at the volume, is the master key. This is why a prenup is just paper. A prenup might have guaranteed me $50 million. This contract guaranteed me absolute control and the right to annihilate the fraud that threatened my creation. I opened the book to the critical page. Section 14.3. The legal language stiff, precise, and unforgiving was my own legacy. Robert had seen only the success of the company. I had always seen the potential for its ultimate failure, and built the failsafe accordingly. The emergency board meeting began sharply at 6 a.m. The directors, men and women who had spent decades deferring to Robert Sintard. The room with a palpable mixture of fear and confusion. They were reeling from the news of the failed acquisition and the CEO's sudden arrest. I stood at the head of the table, not seated, demanding their immediate attention. I did not waste time with pleasantries or condolences. "Gentlemen, ladies," I began, my voice clear and ringing with absolute authority. "The Atlas Dynamics acquisition has failed. The reason is not a market issue or a buyer withdrawal. The reason is executive fraud orchestrated by Robert Thorne. His actions tempting to sell the company using a fraudulent signature and coercing a notary triggered the key man signatory clause. This clause is not up for debate." I slammed the founding charter onto the table, the heavy thud silencing the room instantly, effective immediately as the principal shareholder who acted to prevent the catastrophic failure of this corporation. I have assumed sole executive authority and the role of CEO. The fraudulent executive has been excised. A nervous director, a man named Henderson, who had always been Robert's loyalist, cleared his throat. "Evelyn, with all respect, this is unprecedented. Robert will argue that the clause only applies to the acquisition itself. His marital share and executive stock options must still be managed through standard divorce court." I fixed him with a cold, unwavering stare. "Incorrect, Mr. Henderson. The key man clause voids the sale, but its true power lies in its malice penalty. Robert's actions were declared to be in direct malice towards the corporation. Therefore, his right to any asset derived from Atlas Dynamics, including all executive stock options, performance bonuses, and his salary, the very assets that constitute his wealth, are now subject to the corporate penalty for malice. His entire fortune, derived from this company, is now deemed hostile to the corporation, I clarified, the weight of the statement crushing any further dissent. Under corporate law, those assets can and will be returned to the company to mitigate the legal and reputational damages he has caused. The board session became a demonstration of unassailable legal power. My attorneys, via secure video link, filed the civil motion, the writ of corporate malice, concurrently with the criminal charges. The civil motion stated explicitly that Robert's crime against the corporation meant the total forfeiture of all assets tied to Atlas, leaving him only with whatever minor non-corporate assets he had acquired. This was the final, devastating distinction from the prenup strategy. A prenup would have left Robert with half of the company's value. The key man clause left him with zero. I then turned to the critical matter of reconstruction. The $2.1 billion was not lost. It was simply voided, meaning it never legally left the Japanese consortium's bank account. The Japanese consortium is not our enemy, I announced to the board. They were merely victims of Robert's fraud. I have already contacted their CEO. We will stabilize the company, eliminate the fraudulent liabilities Robert created, and restructure the acquisition agreement. We will sell them the company, but on my terms, with full disclosure and with all proceeds flowing through the clean corporate structure I created. I was not running from the deal. I was taking the deal back. I had voided the sale only to ensure I was the one holding the pen and setting the price. I was not just restoring my life. I was multiplying my power. The board, witnessing the ruthless efficiency and legal clarity, abandoned their loyalties to the disgraced former CEO, Henderson, and the others quickly affirmed their allegiance. Realizing the Matriarch was the only stable force left in their chaotic corporate universe, the board meeting ended with a unanimous vote confirming my position as CEO and chairman, granting me sweeping powers to stabilize the company and mitigate the fallout from Robert's criminal actions. I left the boardroom, the founding charter tucked securely under my arm, and walked to the corner office, Robert's former office space I had helped design decades ago. I sat at the vast desk, a sense of profound, quiet satisfaction settling over me. My entire life had been a series of strategic maneuvers, culminating in the 18-month performance of a senile wife. Robert had dismissed me as a simple domestic partner. Nathan saw me as a barrier to wealth. The market viewed me as a liability, but the Master Keitha corporate contract proved them all wrong. It proved that the true source of power is not held in the public display of wealth, but in the meticulously crafted legal structures that protect your intellectual and financial sovereignty. My legal team was already ensuring Robert's immediate financial immobility. The criminal charges were filed. The civil suit was served. His final pathetic escape route storage unit for 4B was being emptied by Sandra Voss. Robert Thorne was truly, absolutely alone, stripped of his fortune, his title, and his dignity. The total comprehensive nature of my victory was the Matriarch's final, unwavering decree. My thoughts drifted to the competitor's simple ending, a solo tour of Tuscany. My journey was far more complex. Tuscany would wait. First, I had an empire to stabilize, a legacy to secure, and a clear, powerful message to send to every woman who had ever been underestimated. Don't just protect your assets with a simple piece of paper. Build your power into the foundation of the empire itself. The emergency meeting was concluded, the corporate coup complete. I was officially the CEO and chairman of Atlas Dynamics. But the true act of vindication was not the vote of the compliant board. It was the final, irreversible legal and financial maneuver that cemented Robert's demise on a global scale. This required the immediate, ruthless execution of the writ of corporate malice. I sat in Robert's former chair, the glass wall of the office offering a panoramic, cold view of the city. I placed the phone on the speaker, initiating the prearranged conference call with the two key figures whose worlds had just been nullified. Mr. Kagawa, the chief legal officer for the Japanese consortium, the buyers, and Mr. Vance, Robert's notoriously expensive and arrogant corporate defense attorney. Kagawa was reeling from the catastrophic failure of the $2.1 billion acquisition. Vance was still operating on the arrogant assumption that this was a simple, negotiable corporate hiccup. My task was to disabuse them both. I spoke first, my voice devoid of emotion. Mr. Kagawa, Mr. Vance, I initiated this call to confirm the current status. The Atlas Dynamics acquisition has been definitively voided ab initio due to executive fraud. The $2.1 billion remains securely in your consortium's accounts. Mr. Kagawa, the immediate threat is not financial loss, but reputational and legal exposure for all parties involved. Vance immediately burst onto the line, his voice shrill with indignation. Mrs. Thorne, this is an illegal, hostile action. Robert is still the CEO. You cannot unilaterally invoke that ridiculous keyman clause. We are filing an injunction right now. You are attempting to bankrupt your own husband. On the contrary, Mr. Vance, I replied, cutting him off with surgical precision. I am attempting to save the corporation that your client attempted to destroy. Your client is no longer the CEO. This morning, he was arrested for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and identity theft. I have secured the unanimous vote of the board granting me full executive authority. Your injunction will be immediately rejected on the grounds of criminal malfeasance. I escalated the threat, focusing on the legal jeopardy Vance now faced if he continued to defend the indefensible. I needed him to realize that defending Robert meant implicating his entire firm in the corporate fraud. Mr. Vance, I advise you to review the evidence package transmitted to the district attorney's office 5 minutes ago. I continued. It includes video footage of your client coaching an actress to impersonate me, his confession of hiding assets in storage unit 44B, and the sworn testimony of Notary Thorne regarding his coercion. If you continue to defend this action, your firm will be named as a co-conspirator in the civil suit for mitigating damage against Atlas Dynamics. The threat hit home. The corporate defense world operates on calculated risk. Naming a major law firm in a multi-billion-dollar fraud case, backed by video evidence of their client's malice, was an immediate, career-ending catastrophe for Vance. The silence on his line was palpable. Mr. Kagawa, the Japanese legal officer, spoke then, his tone guarded but respectful. Mrs. Thorne, our consortium needs certainty. We relied on the CEO's legal representation. Can you guarantee the company's patent portfolio and regulatory standing is clean, or has the fraud compromised the core value? Mr. Kagawa, the fraud was personal, not systemic, I assured him. It involved the attempt to secure my signature. The patents and regulatory filings remain clean. The only instability was Robert Thorne. I am the sole creator of the wealth and the stabilization force of this company. I offer you an immediate written guarantee of the company's integrity and propose a restructured acquisition agreement to be signed within 72 hours. On my terms. This will protect your investment and mitigate the global market shock. I was not simply recovering the company. I was leveraging the crisis. By offering the Japanese consortium immediate stability and a path back to the deal, I turned the buyer into an ally. The $2 billion world Robert nullified was about to be rebuilt. It's entirely under my control. Vance finally returned to the call, his voice now stripped of arrogance, replaced by raw desperation. Mrs. Thorne, I advise Robert to cooperate fully. We accept the criminal indictment. But for the civil matter, the marital assets, I urge you to reconsider the writ of corporate malice. That forfeiture is punitive. It leaves him with nothing. That is precisely the point, Mr. Vance, I responded, my voice sharp with vindication. Robert Thorne spent 18 months actively attempting to void my identity and my contribution to this partnership. He attempted to declare me mentally incompetent to steal every dollar I earned. The writ of corporate malice is not punitive. It is the just and necessary consequence of his actions. He chose to destroy the corporate foundation. Therefore, he forfeits every marital asset derived from that foundation. I detailed the legal finality. The writ not only seizes his executive stock options, it reclaims all salary and bonuses earned during the period of his fraud, returning the funds to Atlas Dynamics. His actions ensure the divorce is not a division of assets, but a simple termination of liability. He leaves the marriage with only the debts he incurred during his criminal enterprise. The call concluded with Kagawa agreeing to the restructured agreement and Vance issuing a defeated, choked statement that he would advise Robert to cooperate immediately. The $2 billion world Robert cherished was fully nullified. Its pieces handed over to me for reconstruction. The internal emotional satisfaction of this moment, the moment of complete, unassailable vindication, was profound. It was the realization that my intellect, the very thing Robert had tried to label as senile, was the only thing that remained standing. I initiated a final call, not to a lawyer, but to my lead forensic auditor, Sandra Voss. Sandra, the writ of corporate malice is active. I need a full accounting of all funds recovered from Storage Unit 44B. I want a precise tally of every dollar Robert intended to use for his escape. Sandra's voice was quiet, respectful. Evelyn, the unit contained his encrypted ledger and 5 duffel bags filled with gold bullion and bearer bonds. The total value of liquid recoverable assets is $78 million. It was his personal war chest. I smiled, a cold, focused expression of victory. Ensure those funds are immediately designated for the Evelyn Thorne Philanthropic Trust for Ethics in Corporate Governance. Robert's escape fund will now be used to teach future CEOs the cost of malice. The ultimate vindication was not just the seizure of his empire, but the symbolic reversal of his final act of greed. My final act that day was to walk the length of the executive floor, a space that had been Robert's kingdom. I stopped at the office of Nathan Thorne. My godson's nameplate was still on the door. Nathan was gone, taken into custody, facing the consequences I had promised. But I paused, reflecting on the fate I had chosen for him. A price paid, but a life recoverable. I entered his office, which was sterile and quiet. I left a small handwritten note on his desk. Next to his framed Yale diploma, Nathan, you made a choice for greed over integrity. You have paid the price for malice. Do not mistake my restraint for forgiveness. When you return, the offer still stands. Integrity, when rebuilt, is the only true source of wealth. The Matriarch's will is complete. Use your second chance wisely. I was not just settling scores. I was defining a legacy of accountability. I closed the door to his office gently. The world Robert built was now officially mine. The vindication was total, measured in billions, sealed by a corporate contract, and executed with the precision of a master strategist. The resolution of a high-stakes conflict is rarely a single, cinematic moment. It is a slow, quiet unfolding of consequences. Robert Thorne was now securely held, his legal defenses shattered by the unassailable evidence of his own greed. Atlas Dynamics was stabilized, the corporate chaos contained by the sheer authority of my immediate takeover. The revenge was complete. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, then the legal teams handled the meticulous process of criminal prosecution and civil forfeiture. I realized the final battle was internal. My victory was corporate, but my freedom had to be personal. The competitor's protagonists simply walked away to a vacation. My journey demanded more. The life I bought back was not purchased with money. It was bought back with pure intellect, an investment of 18 months of meticulous observation, strategic planning, and emotional repression. I had played the senile wife, the aging matriarch, the disposable burden. Now, it was time to reclaim Evelyn Thorne, the woman beneath the armor. I spent the next month performing the duties of the CEO with cold, focused efficiency. I restructured the board, eliminated the pockets of corruption Robert had fostered. and personally renegotiated the acquisition with the Japanese consortium this time, on terms that were entirely beneficial to Atlas Dynamics and my continued control. The $2.1 billion deal was back on the table, but with a new matriarch holding the pen. But even as the patents were secured and the final contracts were drafted, I felt a deep, profound exhaustion. Not the performative fatigue I had faked for Robert, but the genuine weariness of a general who has successfully concluded a long, brutal war. I needed a final separation, a moment of profound, absolute disconnect from the world I had just annihilated and rebuilt. My choice was Tuscany. Tuscany was not an escape. It was a recalibration. I had chosen a secluded villa nestled deep in the Chianti Hills. Far from the jarring rhythms of Wall Street and the sterile architecture of corporate power, the air smelled of cypress, ancient stone, and sun-warmed earths, the complete antithesis of the fear and stale whiskey that clung to. Suite 402. I arrived alone. There were no assistants, no security details, and no emergency comms terminals. I carried only a simple leather satchel containing my worn academic journals, few essential changes of clothing, and one symbolic possession, the founding charter of Atlas Dynamics. I brought the master key with me not to use it, but to remind myself of the power it represented, the power I held, not the power I needed to exert. The first few days were disorienting. I found myself instinctively scanning the horizon, listening for the sound of an alarm, waiting for a crisis that would demand my immediate strategic response. The habit of vigilance, the 80-month pattern of searching for betrayal, was deeply ingrained. I had to teach myself how to simply be. I walked the winding dirt roads, feeling the sun on my face. I engaged in the simple, uncomplicated pleasures Robert had always mocked, tasting the olive oil, studying the light on the medieval stone towers, and most importantly, reading. I did not read financial reports. I read the ancient texts, philosophy, history, the foundational wisdom of civilization. This period of intellectual solitude was crucial. It allowed me to transform the trauma of betrayal into the clarity of true self-worth. I realized that my most valuable asset was not Atlas Dynamics or the millions I controlled. My most valuable asset was my mind, the intellect that had allowed me to see the malice, plan the defense, and execute the perfect, unassailable counterattack. The true difference between my resolution and the competitor's simple escape was illuminated one evening as I sat overlooking the vast, rolling landscape. The competitor's protagonist left because she had nothing left to stay for, seeking only personal relief. I left because I had secured everything, not just my fortune, but my fundamental self-respect. My freedom was purchased not by a judge's decree, but by my own strategic genius. I thought of Robert, now facing the full weight of the judicial system, his multi-million-dollar escape fund, the $78 million in gold and bonds already seized and repurposed for philanthropic causes in my name. He was stripped bare, his only recourse being the very legal system he tried to corrupt. His fate was sealed by the recorded evidence of his own voice. I thought of Nathan, serving his time, the lesson of accountability burned into his youthful ambition. He had a future because I chose to grant him one. Prioritizing justice over total annihilation, my life, meanwhile, was expanding. I was not just a survivor. I was a creator during my time in the stillness of Tuscany. I began the outline for a new book, not an academic treatise, but a deep exploration of behavioral vulnerability in executive leadership. A book that would use the Thorne Atlas Dynamics case study, my story, as its foundational text. I would dissect the predictable patterns of greed, the hubris of the alpha male, and the psychological blind spots that lead the most powerful people to their own self-destruction. This book would be my new legacy, a powerful, informative warning to the world, funded entirely by the escape money Robert had intended for his own comfortable exile. I was monetizing his malice and transforming his shame into global wisdom. This quiet reconstruction of self was the true final act of the Matriarch. I had proven that money is power, but intellect, when applied with moral clarity, is ultimate power. My vacation was not a retreat. It was a rearming. I was rebuilding my energy, refining my purpose, and charting a new course for Atlas Dynamics, a company that would now operate with an absolute commitment to ethics and accountability, free from the shadow of Robert's corruption. The final, symbolic moment came a week before my scheduled return. I climbed a steep, rocky hill near the villa to the ruins of an ancient watchtower. The view from the top was breathtaking. Spanning 50 miles of untouched Italian countryside, I reached into my satchel and pulled out the heavy, leather-bound founding charter, the document that held the keyman clause. The master key. I did not destroy it. I did not cast it into the wind. I held it firmly, feeling the weight of the years and the power it represented. "You were a weapon," I whispered to the document, addressing the sheer, cold finality of the contract. "And you secured my freedom. You've secured the company, but your purpose is complete." I then placed the charter back in the satchel. The legal structure was secure. The emotional chains were broken. The reliance on a single, perfect instrument of power was over. The life I bought back was one of absolute, unassailable sovereignty. I had secured a global, multi-billion-dollar corporation not through inheritance or luck, but through the superior deployment of my intellect. I had redefined my legacy from being Robert Thorne's wife to being Evelyn Thorne, the matriarch, the CEO, and the author of my own uncompromising future. My story serves as a final, powerful lesson. Distinct from any simple narrative of divorce, do not seek mere separation from the source of your pain. Seek absolute control over the narrative and the structure that fueled the betrayal. The master key is not a shield against loss. It is the blueprint for total victory. I finally closed the book on the tragedy of Robert Thorne. Tuscany had given me back my equilibrium, my focus, and my profound, quiet certainty. I was ready to return to the world, not as the former wife of a disgraced CEO, but as the principal shareholder who saved an empire. I smiled, a genuine, serene expression of power. The competitor's story ended with the hope of a new beginning. My story ends with the certainty of a magnified legacy. The matriarch's will was executed, the life was bought back, and the intellect that saved it was stronger than ever.